Do you think we'll ever make another change to the U.S. Constitution? We're kind of a divided country, right? And you need a lot of buy-in. These are the things that keep me up at night. But look, politics, it often feels like a popularity contest. It's a system where we count votes to see whose career lives on, whose idea lives on, and whose careers and ideas come to an end. In a system like that, it can be tempting to just say what people want to hear. And the courage it must take to say what must be heard, well, that can be in short supply. But our nation was built with that kind of courage. And you can read about some of those leaders in the book that John F. Kennedy famously wrote, Profiles in Courage. This man's name I'm about to tell you about, he was never highlighted in that book. But he challenged his own party, and he left his own party twice. He also bent the will of American presidents, wrote an amendment into the U.S. Constitution, and built a coalition strong enough to pass it.
You probably don't know his name.
He was not a showboat or an attention seeker.
But George Boutwell was a force of political nature.
Very, very ahead of his times.
In the 1830s and 40s, Boutwell was a Democrat.
The Democrats were the working man's party back then, but they were also very pro-slavery. And by the 1850s, George just couldn't stomach their pro-slavery stance, so he left the party and worked with others to found the Republican Party in the mid-1850s.
One of the pivotal moments, the U.S. Supreme Court decision denying St. Louis natives Dred and Harriet Scott their freedom and their right to be considered citizens of the United States.
He thought it was a travesty.
Boutwell went from governor of Massachusetts to congressman, forging friendships with President Abraham Lincoln and General Ulysses S. Grant, and in between them, taking on another president hostile to their legacies.
George was one of the impeachment leaders.
After Lincoln's assassination, George Boutwell led the charge, taking on a president who would go down in history as one of America's worst ever, Andrew Johnson.
He starts issuing pardons to former Confederates who had taken up arms against the Union government, presidential proclamations, executive orders, kind of reinstating the rights and privileges of all of these people who had been in rebellion against the U.S. And again, the Republicans in Congress said, whoa, wait a minute, let's go a little bit slower here. We have 4 million blacks who've recently been freed. They have no housing, no jobs. They don't know what they're going to do. We've got to take care of these people and make them full citizens.
It's in the middle of these historic debates that would define our union that a key question emerges in the push for the 14th Amendment. Who really belongs here? Who qualifies to bear that name? American.
And I think original intent is a really important principle here.
It's a question the courts have considered settled since the Civil War. But back then, we didn't have the same modern-day distinction we now use to describe documented or undocumented immigrants. Either way, if you were born here, you were a citizen.
All children today, be they documented or undocumented immigrants, they're subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. So George would have said they, fall into the category of deserving birthright citizenship.
But that could change if President Donald Trump gets his way. In an executive order, Trump imagines a new definition of birthright citizenship, arguing the 14th Amendment never anticipated the surges we've seen in illegal border crossings.
And that's a legitimate point that the courts should decide. And if the president wants to raise that issue with the courts, I, for one, have no problem with that, because it is a distinction that didn't apply back then. It's a new situation. On the other hand, remember when people are talking about the Second Amendment, they talk about original intent. They don't take into account things how are things different today. They just say original intent. So you can't have it both ways. Either you're for original intent for what it meant then, or you say we've got to take current realities into account.
Or you can go draft a new amendment.
Right. And so I would say, yes, you can take new realities into account, but don't proclaim that in 2 weeks, every child of an undocumented immigrant no longer has birthright citizenship. That is denying the efficacy of the 14th Amendment.
So will we ever change our Constitution again? I don't know. It seems far-fetched. But if we do, it will take the kind of courage that George Boutwell showed, the kind willing to think and speak freely and boldly, focusing on what's just and fair, not just what you're told, maybe even calling out friends of yours. Until next week, we're off the record.